Let's start with the safest ground, the states neither side is realistically fighting over. On the Democratic side, you've got Washington, Oregon, California, Hawaii, New Mexico, Colorado, Illinois, New York, Vermont, Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island, New Jersey, Maryland, Delaware, Virginia, and Washington, D.C. These states are locked down by dense urban populations, deep democratic infrastructure, and demographic trends that have been building for years. That gives Gavin Newsom 208 electoral votes before a single competitive vote is even counted. Republicans have their own fortress. Utah, Idaho, Montana, Wyoming, North Dakota, South Dakota, nearly all of Nebraska, with the one exception being its 2nd congressional district, which actually leans blue. Kansas, Oklahoma, Arkansas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Tennessee, Kentucky, West Virginia, South Carolina, and Alaska. These are deeply conservative, heavily rural, and reliable in turnout year after year. That puts J.D. Vance at 104 electoral votes to start. Now we move into the likely tier, where things start to get a little more textured. On the Democratic side, Minnesota, New Hampshire, and Maine are all likely blue. They're competitive on paper, but Democrats hold a consistent edge in federal-level races, and the voter coalitions there tend to favor them when it counts. That pushes Newsom up to 227. For Republicans, Texas, Florida, Indiana, and Missouri sit in the likely red column. These states aren't the locks they used to be. Texas and Florida especially have been trending less predictable, but Republicans still hold a real structural advantage there. That brings Vance to 195. Now we're getting into the lean states, and this is where the actual political story starts. These are states where one party has the edge, but it's not locked in. A shift in turnout, a change in mood, and the whole thing flips. Let's start with Michigan, leaning Democratic. Michigan is basically a case study in how the modern Democratic coalition got rebuilt across the Midwest. You've got strong margins in Detroit and college towns like Ann Arbor and Lansing, sure, but the real story is the suburbs. Detroit's suburban ring has been drifting away from Republicans for several cycles now, with 2024 standing out as something of an exception rather than the rule. The wild card is the working class vote in smaller cities and rural counties where Republicans have made real gains over the last decade. But in a weaker economy, those voters don't automatically stay put. They get restless, and that restlessness can cut either direction. In this model, Democrats hold their losses down just enough in those areas while maximizing turnout in Metro Detroit. It's not a comfortable win. We're talking a few points tops, but Michigan stays lean Democratic. By the way, please leave your questions or comments in the comments section. I will answer each one individually as time permits. Also, I would be very happy if you like the video and subscribe to my channel. Now let's continue. Pennsylvania might be the single most complicated battleground in the entire country. Philadelphia and its suburbs have become an enormous source of Democratic strength, not just for Pennsylvania, but as a model nationally, especially as college-educated suburban voters keep drifting away from the GOP. But rural Pennsylvania and its smaller towns have moved hard in the opposite direction. So this race really comes down to arithmetic. Can Democrats run up the numbers in and around Philly enough to offset what they're losing everywhere else? In a neutral national environment, this is a true toss-up. But when the broader climate is working against Republicans, especially on the economy, Democrats tend to get a little extra lift in the suburbs. That's the tipping point here. It's not dramatic, but it's enough to hand Newsom the edge in Pennsylvania. Nevada is a different animal entirely. It's smaller, more volatile, and almost entirely dependent on turnout, specifically in Clark County, home to Las Vegas. Democrats lean heavily on union voters and the service industry workforce there, and when their ground game is firing on all cylinders, they win. When it's not, Republicans have shown they can absolutely compete, and they've made real strides recently with working class and Hispanic voters. That's why Nevada always ends up closer than the polls suggest going in. But in this model, the Democratic turnout machine holds up. Clark County delivers. Washoe County stays competitive enough not to be a problem. And Democrats squeak out a narrow statewide win. Lean blue, but just barely. Now, flipping to the Republican side of the lean column, we start with Ohio. Ohio has undergone a real transformation over the last 10 years. What used to be the swing state, the one everybody watched, has shifted noticeably rightward. Republicans now dominate rural Ohio and have built advantages that run deep across most of the state. Democrats still hold their ground in Cleveland, Columbus, and Cincinnati, but those margins haven't been enough to offset what's happening everywhere else. Could Democrats compete here in a strong national year for them? Sure, but even accounting for the current headwinds facing Republicans, Ohio doesn't swing back far enough in this model. The GOP's advantage here is too entrenched. It's closer than it was a few cycles ago, but Ohio stays red, lean, but red. And then there's Iowa, which follows a similar arc to Ohio, just more extreme. This used to be a state that leaned Democratic at times, genuinely competitive in presidential years. But the shift toward Republicans over the past decade, especially in rural counties, has been dramatic. Democrats still do well in Des Moines and Iowa City, but those population centers simply aren't large enough to offset the rest of the state. What keeps Iowa in lean instead of likely is the potential movement among suburban and college-educated voters. If Democrats have a genuinely strong national cycle, they can close the gap. But flipping it outright is still a real stretch. In this projection, Republicans hold on. Not by a landslide, but clearly enough. With the lean states locked in, Newsom climbs to 267 electoral votes, just 3 shy of the presidency, while Vance moves up to 218. And now we've arrived at the part of the map that actually decides everything, the tilt states. These are the races where the margins are razor thin, where the outcome isn't really about partisan identity anymore. It's about who shows up and who gets persuaded in the final stretch. Let's start with Arizona. This is one of the clearest examples of long-term political realignment happening in real time. Over the last decade, Arizona has gone from reliably Republican to a genuine toss-up, and a huge part of that is the suburban shift in Maricopa County. College-educated and independent voters there have been drifting away from the GOP, especially in cycles where the Republican brand gets tied to divisive national controversies. Now stack that trend on top of the current environment, an unpopular war, economic dissatisfaction nationwide, and you've got exactly the conditions that push swing voters toward the opposition. Republicans still have a strong rural base in Arizona, but it's not enough on its own to counterbalance what's happening in the suburbs. In a neutral year, this is a coin flip. In this environment, Arizona tips Democratic, narrowly, but it tips. Georgia comes down to turnout and growth, full stop. Metro Atlanta has exploded over the past decade, and that growth has disproportionately benefited Democrats. Younger voters, more diverse populations, suburban realignment. Republicans still dominate rural Georgia, which is exactly why this state stays so competitive. But here's the key dynamic. In high turnout presidential cycles, the Atlanta suburbs carry more weight than anything else on the map. And when Republicans are facing national headwinds, even a small dip in suburban support is enough to flip the entire state. It's not a landslide. We're talking a point or two. But Democrats hold the edge in Georgia. Wisconsin lands in the tilt blue column, and it's about as evenly split as a state can get. Strong Democratic numbers out of Milwaukee and Madison, strong Republican numbers in rural areas, and then a small cluster of swing counties that ends up deciding the whole thing. What makes Wisconsin so sensitive is how directly it reacts to the national mood. When voters feel like the country's heading in the wrong direction, especially economically, that frustration shows up almost immediately in Wisconsin's results. In this scenario, economic dissatisfaction plays a major role. Democrats don't need a big win here. A modest turnout bump in Milwaukee, combined with limiting their losses in rural counties, is enough to flip the state back. And finally, North Carolina, probably the most frustrating state on this entire map if you're a Democrat. The Research Triangle, Charlotte, and the surrounding suburbs have all been trending blue for years. Real, genuine gains, but Republicans still maintain a structural advantage statewide built on consistently strong rural turnout that the GOP has gotten very good at maximizing. Even in a difficult national environment for Republicans, that advantage doesn't just disappear. Democrats get close genuinely close, and this is absolutely a state to watch in future cycles, but Republicans hold on just barely. North Carolina goes tilt red, and there it is, the AI's full 2028 presidential election prediction. When every single state is filled in, Gavin Newsom finishes with 304 electoral votes to J.D. Vance's 234. That's a clear, decisive win in this model, but don't let the final number fool you into thinking this race is comfortable, because it absolutely isn't. Strip away the headline number and look at what's actually holding this map together. Arizona, Georgia, Wisconsin, even Pennsylvania and Michigan. A shift of just 1 or 2 points in any combination of those states, whether it's turnout, an improving economy, or a change in the national mood, could flip multiple states and completely rewrite this outcome. What makes this projection genuinely interesting isn't just the final score, it's the why behind it. In this model, it's the convergence of conditions, an unpopular war, economic frustration, sliding approval numbers that pushes just enough swing voters away from Republicans in exactly the states where it matters most. And in modern presidential politics, that's really all it takes to flip the outcome of an entire election. So while this particular map shows a strong Democratic win, don't mistake that for inevitability. This race, as it stands today, is still wide open, and it could tighten or completely flip the closer we get to Election Day. What do you think? Drop your own 2028 prediction in the comments. I want to hear who you think actually wins this one. If you got something out of this breakdown, hit like, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.